Well, hello and welcome to the Practitioner Podcast. This is a podcast from us at Renaissance. We're a network of missional practitioners of microchurches in the greater Boston area. Every episode, we're talking about themes around living on mission and living in microchurch communities. Our conversations are hoping to be practical, touching on the realities of everyday, ordinary people just like us. And this is because our mission is about cultivating beautiful kingdom people. That's what we hope to be, embedded in the everyday stuff of life. So, hello, my name is Christine Lee, and I'm here with the one and only...
Drew Thurman.
Yes. Okay, so I'm super excited today because we're talking about one of my favorite, maybe spicy topics, but I thought we would start with something fun, but, maybe we'll get a little sassy. And I thought, since we're talking about leadership, and we both used to work in mega churches, that's a story for another day.
That was the start of our friendship.
That was the start of our friendship.
Yeah.
Trauma can really bind people together. But I was wondering, what's like a leadership maxim you heard while working in that kind of like mega church, corporate-y church world that you still think about that you're like, this is the worst?
There's a lot of phrases. And honestly, I have to repent. I uttered a lot of them myself. There's seasons like I look back, or occasionally I'll pull up some old message I gave and I just cringe a little bit, like, oh my goodness, why did I buy into this language model for leadership? But the one that drives me, I think even then bothered me, and now just really bothers me, is if you're like at a conference of pastors, or like a leadership, seminar or something, where you'll hear some leader say, my flock, or my people. It just grates me every single time. And I just want to yell, I just want to stand up and they're not your people. Or, you're not Moses, that's the other thing. I just want to stand up and yell. So yeah, that very hierarchical, possessive, language. I find it very unhelpful. And, even when I was in some of those existing structures, that was one that I never really liked.
Yeah. Okay, but be for real. Were you ever a pastor, Drew?
I've never really wanted to be. I've had people, but no, I've always resisted pretty hard on having some extra title. The movement of churches I grew up in, we didn't have a lot of extra titles given. Ironically, it was viewed almost more biblically sound to call yourself an evangelist, in some of the more deeper circles of the movement I grew up in. But yeah, no, anyone ever called me Reverend Thurman or Pastor Drew, I'm out. No, I'm sorry.
That's amazing. I think we come from the same movement, Storm Campbell Restoration Movement, but It was interesting because I feel like my entire experience was very not title focused until the last couple churches I worked at. Maybe it was just a new trend, but everyone on staff was Pastor so and so, and I was like, that's not for me. Thank you though.
Yeah.
That's fine. So if you want to get under my skin fast, it's say to me, smile down, frown up, and just get ready for me to lose my mind.
I need to write this down. I'm gonna say this when I really want to bother you for fun.
This is now I work in corporate, and I feel the phrase in corporate that's kind of similar, but similar through thread is fake it till you make it. People always say that, and it's in my corporate job, when people say it to me, I literally have a guttural reaction of I will not. Yeah. Don't say that to me. But when I worked in churches, it was this smile down, frown up. And I think it's the same thing. It's the hierarchy, but it was really big on don't let people below you, literally was the language, below you, know anything bad's ever happening.
Yeah.
And then
positive vibes.
Positive vibes only, because that's what church is about. Only positive vibes. Yeah. And it was just, one church I worked at literally printed it out into a giant canvas and put it in the office walls to remind us this was the truth. And yeah, and I think it's interesting because I agree with you that I think about some of the things, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more, that there are things I did subscribe to in the leadership models
Yeah.
while I was in it. But that was one that I was just like, I will frown at everyone. Leave me alone.
Do you even know me? Yeah.
I know. I'm like, I'm from New England. I'm going to frown at you. Please leave me alone.
That's too good. Well, you've kind of already led us there, but if anyone's checking out this episode for the first time, we go back and forth every episode of who brings the theme. Sometimes neither one of us bring it. We have a host. We host and then have a guest that we chat with on some topic they've brought that they're passionate about. But today, Christine, you are the one bringing the theme to this episode. We've kind of already hinted a little bit at it. But yeah, what are we chatting about?
Yeah, today we're going to talk about polycentric leadership and mutuality, which I feel like sounds like a whole string of words. But I'm really excited about this because I think, at least for us at Renaissance, it's huge at our network level, but it's also really important in the way that we hopefully set up our microchurches, experience our microchurches. And I mean, at the end of the day, I think this way of attempting to live is really beneficial no matter what sector of life you're thinking about. But polycentric leadership, I think the way we talk about it is like distributed leadership. So there's leadership is not the function of just one singular person. There's no like lead pastor or CEO like mentality, but it's instead leadership is expressed by different people within a community. And I think I feel like we always caveat this too of like, it's not flat leadership. It's not
I'm
like,
glad you're bringing this up.
yeah, like, it's not like everybody has, I don't love the way of like equal say, but like maybe like equal function and weight for every decision. But that doesn't mean every person doesn't matter. And then I think that, again, this feeds really well into mutuality of living together and being full participants, both giving and taking. And I think that mutuality really informs polycentric leadership from my view, because it's not about keeping score, right? When I think about having mutuality in my relationships, it's not like, well, I gave you $5 last week, so now you give me $5 this week. But it's instead about how do we show up relationally in a way where we're bringing our whole selves and we're giving to one another fully and willing to receive from one another fully. And that might look different, and it's not transactional. And I think the same thing about polycentric leadership. I'm sure we'll get more into this, but it's not about a role. It's not about a status symbol. But I think leadership is really a function. I think we talk about it as a function rather than like, you are the leader, you are the center of this part of leadership, but rather it's like, okay, no, like what are the jobs to be done? And thinking about leadership as something, as a way to build other people up and make life and community a little bit easier. What am I missing from your perspective?
No, I mean, I think you nailed it. I mean, the only thing I would walk back, I mean, I know we're going to walk this out a lot more later on in this episode. The definition is just poly, meaning many centers of leadership and not one. And so I think it's really helpful. I like that. I think we've talked about this in a previous episode. I think a lot of us, I am the first person to admit an overcorrection in this area, where in response to hierarchy, we run to flat leadership and we think we're just not going to have leaders and everybody's just is going to be democratic and everyone's going to make decisions together. And that's chaos. I mean, quite frankly. And it's really unhelpful and toxic for a group for multiple different reasons. I think we talked a little bit about that with the social contracts, so I won't hit on all of those points. But it also, I think it's just not being true to who we are. So I think we'll get to this a little bit more, but it's more of a conversational style of leadership is what I would say. There's a lot more back and forth and give and take, and realizing like it's one of those things that, and we'll get to this as well, that you don't really institute. You have to just kind of throw yourself into it and you learn it as you do it. So we'll talk more about that, but I think you hit on it really well. And I think that's why it might sound like we're being a little spicy at the front end, but I think it's important. This is one of those areas where you have to kind of unlearn and you have to talk about what you've come from, because a lot of us don't have any other framework for understanding leadership outside of some of the prevailing models that we've kind of hit on, which is really what I'd like you to start with. Is we hinted at this with our goofing off at the beginning, but leadership's a buzzword, obviously, in our culture. Lots of leadership books. The church in particular loves talking about leadership. There's been a big trend, really probably since the mid 90s, that has really just kind of taken over all sectors of the church, where everything's a leadership problem. John Maxwell's obviously had a big influence there. So what do you typically imagine when you hear the word leadership? What do you think most of us imagine, maybe not just you, but we all imagine when you hear the word leadership? And then what sort of prevailing models exist around this concept that you've experienced? We've hinted at them, but then why are those problematic? So I think that might help us before we get into what polycentric leadership is. I think it's important for us to kind of unlearn maybe some of what is just assumed when it comes to this topic.
Yeah. I think, well, one, to root ourselves in our context, we both live in the United States, and I think that the American church really has taken
I'm glad you clarified that for the 0.2% of listeners coming from Sweden.
Yeah. We are thinking of you. We're global and inclusive. This is just making me think about a sidebar of when the churches I worked at had 3 locations within 10 minutes of each other, but everyone's the global pastor, which I think feeds right into what I'm trying to talk about. And I do think just that there's this idea in the United States and American corporations, and then this has definitely affected the American church, where leadership is in so many ways about exerting power and about status, right? It's being in charge. And it's really interesting because there's a book called Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Kobes-Dumais that I really enjoyed. I read a couple years ago. And she kind of traces this idea of servant leadership that emerged in corporate speak. I forget when, 70s, 80s, but then infiltrated the church. And so I feel for me, I remember even when I went to Bible college, we had so many classes on leadership, and it's all about servant leadership and how Jesus was a servant leader. But really that, on paper, is there anything super wrong with that term? No, but I think it's what it's devolved into in practice, which is, I think the way Kobes-Dumais puts it is authority masked in humility. And I think to me, there's a lot of that, of leadership is about exerting authority. It's about making sure people do what you want and getting them to do what you want. And I think that, honestly, for me, I realized that it really got into my own system, my own body, my own spirituality. And maybe I'll tell a story just to illustrate this of I think when I was in those spaces, I was very resistant in my mind towards this idea of very hierarchical, authoritative leadership of I'm in charge, I'm important, blah, blah. And I really tried to buck against that. But it's also I am a woman of color and a young woman of color in these spaces that were predominantly filled with white male leaders. And I remember, so I didn't have very much authority, that was part of it. But it was really interesting. I remember when I first got into my first secular job, I was a manager at this nonprofit, and I was managing these young adults in an AmeriCorps program. And they were just tough. And I remember I was working on this project, and I was trying to get them motivated, vision casting, blah, blah, blah. And hey, we got to do this thing.
Miles up, frowns down.
Yeah, well, yeah, I definitely said that to them. I didn't. But I felt I did all the leadership things of motivating them. Let's get it done, blah, blah, blah. And there were just a few of them that just kept asking questions. And I had this guttural reaction of why are you asking me questions? I'm in charge. And I was so caught off guard by myself of I noticed I felt that way, and I was this is gross. Why do I feel this way? What is happening? Because intellectually I don't subscribe to that, but I could feel it in my body. That's how I felt. That was my reaction. It's I'm in charge. Stop asking questions. I explained it to you. I did the things I was supposed to do to be a good leader to get you on board, and you're not on board. And so now I'm mad, and I don't like that my authority is being questioned, right? And so I think there's something to that where, again, it is about exerting authority, whether you're doing it in more subtle ways or more overt ways. It doesn't really matter, but it is about who has the position to tell everybody else what to do, and everyone should listen.
Yeah. No, I think that's really good. And I mean, backing up to our again, I appreciate you saying in a North American context. I mean, obviously, leadership in church history is a long, long topic, and it is interesting how often churches have mimicked some of the governmental structures of their day. I think you can probably see that even in some of the way that we break down leadership in the American church. But I do think it wasn't perfect. I do think that there was a little bit of a healthier view of leadership probably 50 or 60 years ago in a lot of our churches. A lot of them were small and medium sized, and there was high relational, even if it was messy or there were
Right.
things that were happening that might have tended towards being more fundamentalist or whatever. There was at least high relational equity across the community. And I think it was
Hmm.
really the rise in the late 80s, early 90s of the megachurch, which is a really new phenomenon
Yeah.
in terms of the global church, but even in North American church, that the church started looking to the corporate world for cues.
Hmm.
Ironically, you work in the corporate space. A lot of how leadership is thought of in the corporate world has taken a massive shift in the last decade.
Yeah.
And yet the church still operates on like mid 90s corporate culture principles in a lot of regard. And so that was really when the rise of leadership started to happen. You started seeing some of these Christian leadership authors start to become pretty prevalent in the books that they were publishing. And I think that's when the language, like if you did one of those Google searches where you're like, you know, show me how the usage of leadership in Christian spaces. I mean, it would go from nothing to just like off the charts in the last, handful of decades. And so it was out of that really became about decision making for the institution. We have so many
Hmm.
people now that we're trying to manage. We don't have relational equity with them necessarily.
Yeah.
And we're now running an organization. And I think you sense that, like, some of the quote unquote elders or shepherds that I grew up with as a kid, I had some really bad stops in the church, but I also like, there's some church experiences that I had wonderful servant leaders who cared, like what you were describing earlier, who cared deeply and wanted to go on hospital calls and wanted to love on people.
Hmm.
And then the shift of like when I was stepping into the space, stepping into some of those circles, and it was like we had clearly identified successful businessmen in the church to
Yeah.
take positions of leadership within, because we were a multi-million dollar entity that we needed to make big decisions for. And so I think that shift
Hmm.
is really what we're getting at. And so some of what we're trying to name, I know not everyone has that church experience, and so I just want to be able to name and kind of walk back the timeline a little bit, because I think that's kind of what we're talking about with what's problematic.
Yeah.
And for a lot of us who maybe are under a certain age, that's our experience in church. That's our experience of leadership within the church. And
Hmm.
so imagining something else is really hard. And what you're describing is, even when we leave some of those spaces, we reenact what we've seen, because that's the only vision we have for how to get people to do what we think they should do.
Right.
And we have no understanding of any other way. And so then we're left with, well, either I keep reenacting my old muscle memory, or what we just talked about as an air two, I just give up on leadership altogether. And what we're going to describe in this episode is that neither one of those are very helpful
Yeah.
ramps, off ramps from the prevailing models that we've kind of seen.
Yeah. And I really love what you're highlighting about how, a lot of our experiences of like leadership models are linked to corporations initially and then therefore linked to institutions. And I think it is a predominant view that most people see church as an institution, right? Like, because there's a lot of church that is institution nowadays, but I think that gets us into why I think polycentric leadership is so important, because it's about untangling ourselves from church as institution, but more of church as family, as community. And I think it sounds so simple in so many ways, but it's so hard to live out. It is so hard,
So hard.
especially if you've been in the models that we've been in. I think for me, it's been a lot of soul
Mm.
searching and maybe being overly cautious or scared, or then getting tired and being like, okay, let me just like do the thing I know how to do. But maybe you can kind of start pushing us there of like, if we were to talk more about this word polycentric and what does that practically look like, and like how is it helpful for reframing the idea of leadership? Yeah, and maybe like what is there biblical evidence for it? Like, you know,
Well, my favorite, like, whenever I talk about this, my favorite example to go to, or I should say metaphor, Brian Sims has a really great example he gives in one of his books, where he compares it to what we're describing to jazz music. And I love jazz music, so I listen to jazz vinyls all the time, and I love going to like a jazz club. And if you know anything about jazz music, you know, obviously it's very expansive, and so this isn't true 100% of it, but most of the time, there's a lot of improv in jazz music, and so typically if you go to a jazz club and you're listening, there's a given chord progression that's being played, and then every musician in the band has their specialty. They typically riff off of that and kind of get to solo and be the feature artist while everyone else plays backup. And then eventually someone else is going to take a turn in response. And, you know, kind of what I was getting at earlier, he says it's this conversational back and forth thing where everyone's taking a turn kind of in their specialty at what they're good at, while everyone else kind of plays backup and plays, you know, that given chord progression. And it's really beautiful, but it's really difficult because you can't learn jazz music via sheet music. Like, it's not just like, I'm going to rehearse this a bunch of times. Like, you just have to kind of throw yourself into it. And the more that you play it, the more that you feel it. I think Herbie Hancock had a quote about that. Like, jazz music isn't something you learn, it's something you feel. And I think that's my experience. And I think I love that metaphor because I think that's my experience in microchurch world, is that it's learning the conversation of letting people lead where they're clearly good or they're gifted or God's doing something in them at this moment.
yeah.
And then like feeling comfortable where God's called me or what I feel like I bring to this community to kind of take lead. And it's clunky at first and you trip over yourself sometimes and you probably have to spend more time explaining that at the beginning, but eventually it becomes really beautiful. Obviously, there's so much evidence. We could spend the rest of the podcast in the New Testament highlighting this illustration. Paul talks a lot about this in Romans chapter 12, about comparing the church to a body, that we all have different roles and responsibilities. We love to talk a lot about Ephesians 4, that there are these different vocations within the life of the church that are there not to do the ministry, but to empower so that everyone can take part and do the ministry. They're not to be the ones at the middle lording over everybody, but to be at the bottom serving so everyone else can actually thrive and lean into their specialty. But I would say the only other example, and I'll highlight this really quickly, I love Acts 6. It's like one of my favorite texts that I think to highlight this. If you know anything about that text, the apostles get word. It's the first time, you know, there's been all these beautiful moments in Acts 2 and Acts 4 where they're sharing everything in common and everything's going great. And you get to Acts 6 and you find out that suddenly these Hellenistic widows are not being fed. And, you know, so obviously there's a racial, cultural component. Some of the other Jewish women that were not Hellenistic, they're not being neglected. They're still being able to be fed. And so they get word of this, and we don't know whether or not this was because we know there was kind of food programs that existed from the temple courts. Was this the Jewish people themselves kind of keeping an arm's length away Greek-speaking people? Or was this all of the Christians had been ostracized from some of those food programs? The church has started to take those on for themselves, and they're neglecting this. Regardless, they take it seriously enough, the injustice, and serious enough that they gather all the church basically together and say, we've got to do something about this. And I think sometimes there's like a misunderstanding because the apostles say like, it's not right for us to like give up, you know, the word and ministry of the word and the prayer to do this. And I think sometimes people have been like, oh, they're above serving in that capacity. This is a hierarchy. which is not, I think, what's going on at all. And in fact, we have to remind ourselves, like, there was no New Testament. They were actually kind of like writing it at that moment. They had spent 3 years with Jesus. They're just trying to pass on some of the lessons that they learned from Jesus. So it was kind of important that they prioritize some of that. But I think it was also a realization in their minds that if we take this on, we're going to have to take on the next one. And then we're going to have to take on the next problem. And then we're going to have to take on the next problem. And suddenly we do have a hierarchy because we're the decision makers where everything's responding to us. Mm-hmm. And I think they also realized, like, we probably aren't the best people in this case to lead in this capacity. And if you read that text, what's really awesome is that they give the problem back to the people and they say, select some people among you who can take charge in this. And what's really cool is they don't pick Aramaic speaking names. All of the names listed are Greek speaking names. So they pick Greek speaking people to take leadership in the life of the church who probably have proximity and presence with these widows who are being neglected and saying, you lead us in this capacity. And I love it. It's this first example of that conversational give and take. Like, you know what? Like, yeah, we could just make this all an MLM to us where we answer and everyone's feeding into us, or we can release this, distribute power to others and say, you lead us in the areas where you're good. And so I think that's kind of what we're trying to get our microchurches to learn on a much smaller level. There might only be 12 of you, there might be 14 of you, there might be 20 of you, but how do you not just have a quote unquote leader who's doing everything, and every time something gets brought to the community, that person swoops in and they take it on, or they do all the cooking and all the hospitality. But rather you look around and saying, where do we have gifts and talents? Where is God doing something in my life? And I'm willing to defer to you in that way.
Yeah. And I think to me that's, this verse always, in Ephesians gets talked about like household codes, but I think about that verse that says submit to one another, right? Out of reverence for Christ. And I think there is a lot in the New Testament when talking about the church that is about mutual submission, not just about household codes, but beyond. And I think as we talk about the Bible, I think something I noticed in the last couple of years is just that as much as I was entrenched in like this like leadership world, there's like not a lot in the Bible that's like explicit about leadership. Not that there's not portraits of leadership. But I think whenever we're quick to like derive these like maxims from something that scripture is not explicit in, we need to be mindful and just cautious and careful of like,
you don't want to quote Proverbs 29:18, without a vision, the people will perish. Come on, Christine.
I do actually. That's my bumper sticker. I do. But I do think there's so much that, like you said about the early church where there's this, how do we show up for one another and really meet the needs? And I think like we're especially at a time in the American church where there's a lot of like reckoning of abuse of power. And I think like, I know this in myself, like I can have a fear of power, of like misusing it in any way because of some of my personal experiences and just like what's happening in our larger cultural context. And at the same time, power is not inherently bad. Like I really like the way that Dr. Diane Langberg talks about it, where she's like, everybody has power. Power is just like the ability to influence. A baby has power. It can cry and probably force its parents to like come take care of it. And so it's not the power itself that is inherently bad, but it does, I think we have to be mindful about how power shapes us and also what we do with it. And I think there's so much, as I've been on this journey, learning that leadership to me now is more about how can I use the things that God has entrusted me with to help others thrive. And so sometimes that's about doing the things I'm good at. And sometimes it's not. Like, and I'm thinking about that, especially like when our microchurch just started, I remember, like I'm so used to leadership being associated with things like being on stage and making things happen and telling people what to do and inspiring people. And I was like, honestly, like being the leader, quote unquote, here is like making dinner. And I don't like cooking. But it's like it was good for me to do that, and that's what our group needed at that time was, and I think that's totally okay.
Yeah. Well, that's really good. Well, why don't you, I'd love you just kind of hinted at it, but I would love for you keep walking that out. Like when we talk about a microchurch setting, we don't just talk about this theoretically. How have you seen polycentric or distributive leadership principles play out? And maybe it's been difficult. So like, feel free to share, like, have there been ways that it's been difficult? Did you feel like there was moments where it was clunkier and you kind of had to trip over each other a little bit and have some open dialogue? I think it'd be fun to kind of pull back the curtain and let people see what it looks like in reality.
Yeah, and I'm sure you have lots of stories too. But I think at the beginning, Johanna and I, started this microchurch together, and we're the leaders of this microchurch in southern New Hampshire. And I put leaders in quotes because it was like there was like a little over two of us, right? It was like basically us, Joy and my mom. And Joy told us she didn't want to lead, so that was part of it. And my mom, I don't think wanted to either. But that like I think automatically put us in like at least for me, I'll only speak for myself. I'm like, okay, like what does it even mean to lead here? There are people that don't want to lead, but like we're just really like getting together, having dinner, and like praying and talking about the Bible at the very beginning. That was like very sparse in our structure. But I also think over time, Johanna and I, because we both come from these like mega church backgrounds, we were very skittish about overexerting anything or over programming things. So I think there was a lot of like almost like too much passivity sometimes, where we just were like, okay, like no one's really saying anything or like really doing anything, and we don't want to just be like, here's what we're doing. So we would just be like, whoop, we're not doing anything, I guess. And then there were a few times where we really tried to rally and be like, I remember we early on were like, let's make these like care packages for folks that are houseless in our area so we can like give them out and like organize this whole thing. And then like at that point we had a few more members of our microchurch, and it kind of just like didn't happen. And I think like part of that was we did try to do a thing and like kind of just place on everyone. I'm like, this would be a good thing to do. This is kind of exciting. And like, it's not that people didn't care, but I think like it didn't come from a space that was like, we are passionate about this as a community. We see this need together. And so, and so it's like, in so many ways, I think sometimes in this model, just telling people what to do really doesn't, I don't think you should do that, but also it kind of doesn't work. They're like
100% true.
Like it just, we were like, yeah, that's cool. And then like, we just never did it. And I think part of it too is like most people who are leading in microchurch spaces are co-vocational, like it's like, it's not when before like my church stuff was like 100% of my life. So I could put a lot of time and energy and make stuff happen, even if other people weren't into it. And now I'm like, if other people aren't into it, like I have other jobs too. So like I can't spend all my time and energy doing it. And I also think like as we have grown and matured and gotten to know each other better, I think that's been the really beautiful part, is that you see that it takes time for people to feel a sense of ownership in the group. I think that's why like the social contract stuff is really important. It's like, it's a way to help people start like getting a grip and like their arms around what your group is, and hopefully helps them have a deeper sense of ownership. And I think it takes time for people to feel comfortable, to find their space, to figure out what this group is. And as like probably most people know in like social group theories, it's like when, especially in smaller groups, when someone new joins, even if they're like the best person ever, it changes the dynamics of the group. So every time you have somebody new, you're all going to have to shift and change and kind of get used to each other. And that's okay. But that I think slows down sometimes senses of ownership too, if you have people that are new. And I think in that, it just takes time for people to figure out how to flex what they can bring and how they might lead in a group. But I think for us, it took a few years, honestly. I think like around like 2-ish years in, people start having ideas and being like, I want us to do this, or like, I'd like for us to try something like this, or can we do this thing together? And it was like, we said that stuff in the beginning of like, we wanted that, but like none of that actually became a reality and in the voices of other people for a while. And I think I just wanted to highlight that of like, I think when you're in the middle, it feels,
Yeah.
at least for me, I'm like, am I doing this wrong? I'm saying
Yeah. Yeah.
that we want this. I am trying, but no one's really catching the vibe. But then I was like, oh, I think if you just stick with it and keep being open, and like I remember a few months in, some people were like, hey, can I host? I'm like, yes, please, please host. And little things like that, it just started shifting and changing, and people got a deeper sense of ownership. And now I think our group is really cohesive, and we're talking more about how can we make sure we don't become insular, because I think there's a deep sense of ownership from like every person that attends regularly and as a part of our microchurch regularly. Yeah, and so I think we're finding a new sense of like, okay, we have a lot of cohesion, but we want to continue to make space for newness and to include anyone that wants to be a part of it. What about you?
Well, I love what you're describing. Yeah, I mean, I feel so much resonance in what you're getting at, and I hope people are listening. I love it's going to take a while for people to feel ownership. I think I've seen since that in my own community. I mean, a few other thoughts that came to my, I mean, it's really hard. I think we just have to own, if you've been a leader, if you're listening to this and you've been a leader in another space, you're probably going to have the most work. Like, I mean, that's just going to we're going to have to name that. Like, and I think that's been the hardest thing is like, I realize like when I step into a community, and I know I'm not alone in this because I've had this conversation with a number of other folks in our network, is that there's an instant anxiety and there's processing going on in my brain that's not happening in everyone else around the circle. So while some of them are trying to just navigate like the relational dynamics, I'm thinking like I need to, I'm just thinking like I need to lead. Yeah. And then there's this constant, like, I feel like I'm walking this tightrope where it's like I'm, because I'm so anxious about it. There's times where I'm like, I don't want to lead. I don't want to lead. I don't want to lead. And I'm walking this tightrope and I fall on the one side where it's like, I think everyone kind of needed me to like step up and kind of take this one. And then there's other times where it's like responding to that anxiety. It's like, I'm just going to take this one. And everyone in the community was like, no, we didn't really need you to take this one. Like, we've got this. And so I think it was like just owning, like, I just need to let go of some of that and just like look into people's eyes and stop being in my own head, like just thinking about the actual people that are there and not necessarily how I'm being perceived and what my role is all the time, I think is a really important thing. And then I think secondarily, like realizing that like this conversation's intertwined with some of the conversations about metrics and success and wins. Like when I would default to just wanting to get stuff done is typically when I was operating from a sense that I didn't think our community was moving quick enough. And I think it's then doing some work of like, what am I trying to prove? Like, where is this coming from? And a lot of times I'm leading because I feel anxious or I want us to prove something to somebody, or I want to validate that this group matters. And so I'm imposing like arbitrary like markers that we need to hit. And so I think if you've stepped in from one of those spaces, like that's a really helpful way to like work through some of that. But then, yeah, I think then like what you're describing is 100% true, is like the community just has to feel it out. I do think there's a sense, there's been moments of just like shared ownership, and it's cool when also I think there's just natural things where the community, the more you do life together, you start feeling permission, like actually you're really good at this, and like we all start to name it and we're like, we could do it, but like it's very clear, like it's summertime, I could grill, but I know you're like 10 times better at this. Like we should probably have microchurch in your backyard if we're going to grill, because you're just better at it than the rest of us. Or we're going to throw this party for our neighborhood, like I could host this, but like remember that last time you hosted the party, you're just thoughtful, like you just like create like an inclusive space. Like we all had a better time at your house than we would anyone else. Like, I think you should take this one on. Or, you act like you can't lead a Bible study. And yet like we got done with the last time you led microchurch and we're all just like, oh my goodness, that was one of the most beautiful things we've ever experienced. You don't have to do it every time, but maybe you should do this for our community a little bit more. So I think it's fun when you get to name those for each other. And then the only other thing I would say is just like, how often having spaces for discernment collectively is also really helpful.
Yes.
And so we not to plug it, we do have a tool you can jump in with Renaissance called Discernment Dinners, which I think is really helpful. But I also think it's just nice when people can name where they feel like God is speaking and doing something in them right at that moment. And so I think almost what you were describing, sometimes where we're discerning where God might be at work is actually operating out of our weakness, or maybe operating out of something that we don't feel like we're necessarily good at. But we're like, in this season, I feel like
Mm-hmm.
God's prompting me there. And the more that we can name that, and like we know where each other are and maybe where the Spirit's leading, where we're hearing God's voice, that also helps us just acknowledge the journey that everyone in our community's on, and then allows us to like better take a step back and like let someone else lead,
Yeah.
and default to them, because it's like, well, no, like we've been processing through this a while. We've been discerning together as a community, and I know what God's doing. And so there's no way I want to shortchange that by
Mm-hmm.
stepping in, and taking something that I think God wants for you and right now. So I think that's really helpful as a community, when it feels like it's not just what's the social dynamic here, what's the most efficient way to do this to keep the
Yeah.
microchurch afloat, but it's also like soaked and saturated in God's voice and His presence
Yeah.
in our midst.
Yeah, and I think as you were talking, I loved what you're describing about just making the wrong call, which I know I've done a lot. And I think that's my encouragement to people too, is that when you don't see church as an institution anymore and you see it as a community, as truly a spiritual family, you don't have to get it right all the time. And I think that's the goal, is that the community, there's enough like resilience in the community to not only like allow you to make mistakes, but also be like, hey, we don't need that.
Yeah.
Please stop.
Yeah.
And that there's and I feel like I noticed when I the difference for me and how it feels is like I felt like I couldn't make a mistake, or I felt like I had to really solve things before coming to the community in the past, because it's like I'm the leader, I'm in charge, I have the title, whatever it is. And like even recently there was like a pretty significant conflict in our microchurch where somebody had a problem with me. And it was I just knew right away. I was like, okay, I can consult. I want to like consult with some people in our microchurch, but eventually I want to talk about this as a microchurch, because like we there's I might have done something wrong, and I want the microchurch to tell me that. I want my microchurch to be like, you shouldn't have handled it like this. And there has to be that level of trust. And I also think there was a side of it of like, I don't want us to be a community that has like weird secrets and hierarchy. Like it's like
Yeah.
in the function of polycentric leadership, it is not about protecting a position. There's nothing to protect. And I think that for me has been a huge thing of like, it's okay. It's like, and I think it's taught me a lot about God too, of like, I think it's never made sense to me in some of the other experiences I've had in church, because it's almost like we treat Jesus as a like, fragile thing. That if we were to allow people to see the cracks in our community or the imperfections of it, it would like give Jesus a bad rep, and then like
Yeah.
everything's gonna fall apart, right? And that never really quite made sense to me, because I'm like, I feel like Jesus is fine.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I feel like he doesn't really need us in general, but wants us, and also that he invites us into it, and he knows we're screwed up. And so I think to me, there's something really beautiful about church being a space that is okay with imperfection and discerns together how we become more like Jesus, knowing he's stable, he's fine. He's not going to lose his mind when we do something wrong or bad, you know.
That's such a good word. Well, why don't you, I'd love for you to like launch us into this last question I'd love us to wrestle through, is just what advice would you give new leaders who are interested in walking out these ideas? So like if they're listening, like maybe they're just exploring this concept, maybe they've jumped onto this podcast because they're just getting a microchurch community going, or they've just gotten one recently and they're listening to us talk and they're like, oh, we maybe need to like stop and pivot here a little bit from where we've been. So where do you think, when you start thinking about like beginning the journey towards polycentric or distributive leadership, where do you think folks should start?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely no expert in this, but I think we started getting at a lot of this, but I think there is a needed self-reflection. And And I think, especially being a therapist, I feel like everybody thinks they're more self-aware than they are. I don't know how many people will come to my office and they're like, I'm self-aware. And then we start talking. I'm like, no, you're not. And I think like, especially in this area, if you're coming from some of the church paradigms that we've come from, it's just easy to assume because you're leaving it, you're good. and, and I just think like, not in like a hostile or anxiety driven way, but just be a little bit more skeptical of yourself. And I think like ask people, like invite people into that. I think some of this I was lucky because our microchurch community formed out of people I had history with, but especially if that's not the case, I think you need to kind of get some of that stuff on the table. Where are you coming from? What are maybe some of the proclivities of the context you come from? And then I really love this question that Chuck DeGroat tells people to ask, is like asking people like, how do you experience me? Like, I think if you have, you don't need to ask it like that, especially if you already have like some sorts of relationship, like try to like surface that conversation so that you can kind of build some like language together about how you want to operate together in community. But then I also think this is something that you did a lot that I think gave me the sense that Renaissance is a community I wanted to be a part of. It was just like giving power away and not holding onto things tightly, and being okay to lose. I think for me that's hard for me because I like being right, and I know my personality's like that.
We all
But
do,
just
yeah.
like, but just being okay with like being misunderstood, being okay with like, okay, like this. Sometimes letting people do things, even if you're like, I could do it better, or it's not going to be that smooth, or it's going to be a disaster. I think sometimes people with actual like leadership skills, you feel like you can kind of like foresee where something is going. And at least from the spaces I've come from, it's like, if I know it's going to be bad, we might as well not do it. Is kind of,
Yeah.
it's kind of the attitude, honestly.
Yeah.
And I think for me, I've learned sometimes it's going to be clunky and it's not going to be smooth, but that doesn't mean it's not worth doing. And you really need to like check those impulses in yourself of like, this isn't going to be what I want it to be, so we shouldn't do it. At least that was like, I think something that lives in me for sure. What about you?
Well, again, I resonate with so much of what you're saying. I mean, I think for me, it would just be going back to that metaphor I gave with jazz music. Like, I think my encouragement for people is, I think there's this fear. It's like people who are maybe the catalyst in getting a community going. It's like, well, I'm just going to lead for a while. I got to get this going. I don't want to ask too much of anybody. And then maybe someday more people will step up. And my experience and now doing this for 7 years is that you don't, like, if that's what you start with, it's kind of be there. Like, it's really hard to, it's like shifting the Titanic with an oar. Like, at that point, you've already kind of have got a lot of experience that you're trying to circumvent. I think, again, it's not something, you can't read enough books on this. You can't like educate people. You just have to just try it. And so I think one of the hardest things is almost what you're describing is like being wrong, like being willing to just like lose, being willing to like for something to not be good, to like for things to be messy, but just realizing like the more that we do, it's going to get more natural. And I think all the while continuing to have conversations about how we feel, what's going on, like naming this thing that we're just going to keep trying this together. And I really appreciate like Jason, Katie, Rashi, when we started with them, were so much better at this naturally than I was. And I look back now, like, I don't know what my microchurch journey would be if they wouldn't have been in the first microchurch that I started. They were just so good at believing like everyone should participate and everyone should have a part. And even if you're not good at it, we just want you to try. And I really it was cringeworthy to me at times. It was slow moving. It was like, it felt like we were trying so hard to get people to like just do anything, but they just wouldn't give it up. Like, no, everyone's going to take turns doing these sorts of things. And it was painful at first, but it got more and more natural. And it became really, really beautiful. And so them having that impulse of mutuality and being inclusive and just saying, we can't do everything for everybody. We've got to let the community all step up. And even if you don't think you're good at leading a Bible study, we still want you to lead one. And it can be 5 minutes, and the next one, everybody else's can be 30 and yours can be 5, but it doesn't matter. We just want you to give it a go. And those sorts of things, like was like jazz. Like we're all going, just to play the chord progression while you riff. And it might be the worst sounding music we've ever heard. But if we don't let you, riff and improvise sometimes, like you're never going to feel comfortable doing it. Yeah. And so I think that would be my encouragement is like, there's not some threshold where your community suddenly has enough mature disciples where you can do it. You just, wherever everybody's at, just from the beginning, just give it a go and just know like the pain points are worth it because you'll feel more natural. And anyone that's ever been on a team knows this. Like when you first start practice, you run plays and it's a disaster. And things don't go the way that they're supposed to go. But the more that you do it, the more comfortable you feel. And yeah, it's the same in microchurch. So just, if you're starting out, just actually try it. And don't think there's some minimum threshold of maturity you have to hit first.
Yeah, that's so good. I remember too, like maybe just like a very practical thing that I think we took this from one of your microchurches a few years ago, where when we did more like, we generally don't do musical worship when we gather, but some people in our microchurch were like, can we do this sometimes? So we're like, okay, like we can. But again, not very many people are like actually like can play instruments. And I was like, I don't want this to be like Christine plays guitar in the living room. Like, I'm like, this feels like my Bible college nightmare. But one of the things I remember hearing from y'all's microchurch is like making it a spiritual potluck, where instead of like this like liturgy and service I build for everybody to experience, it's like, no, everyone just brings something. You have to share it at some point. And it was like such a small thing where it's like, well, the thing I'm bringing is I can play an instrument. But everyone has to bring something. So it no longer becomes, I think it was like just such a practical way to like move against that. Even structurally, like there was a lot, I think in my mind default to like, I guess it has to be like what it used to be. But I think that's the beauty of being a part of a network, is like having inspiration of like, no, it doesn't. We don't have to do it like this. And it has been some of my favorite memories of our microchurch gathering together is like, what did people decide to bring to share and worship? So I think like to me those are the kinds of things where it feels small but feels important, of figuring out how can every person contribute and be a full participant in your community. Any final thoughts?
I don't think so.
Well, then thank you everybody for joining us. We're excited to be on this podcast journey with you and walk through the realities of following God in this everyday life. If you want to find out more about our network Renaissance, you can join us for our microchurches or check out future cohorts. Head to wearerenaissance.org. And without further ado, bye.